at least in our experience, it was really useful for us to talk about some of the deeper issues in life, like how do you decide what kind of medical care you get? We both agreed we were never going to do home birth. That was a no. But we agreed why that was a no, and when for us that changed, and we had, are we at 4 children home births now? 4 children home births, yes. We both agreed on why, and we got there through the same path of logic that led us to not go there in the first place. So you may end up finding you have different answers to the questions later after you are married. But I think it's really important when you are looking at someone potentially to get married to them, you both agree on how you got to this answer that you both have. Because that way you can, along your path in married life, you can come to the same conclusion together in whatever the different, different twists and turns come.
So I'm going to throw this in there real quick. I got to tell you the first question my dear fiance, no, we're recording. The first question she asked me, okay, now we're in a serious relationship. We've already talked about a lot of things. Okay, the first thing she asked me, I had just told her, do you want to entertain a serious relationship? And she said, yes, let's do that. I said, okay, so what do I want to talk about? The first thing she asked me is, what kind of birth control do you believe in? She got right down to the most important issue first and where she was at. And you know what? That's important. So honesty is important. Allowing her, whoever you're interested in, you feel comfortable with it. Now, I had never even really thought about birth control in any way. And so for me, I was like, I kind of probably faked an answer, or I was like, okay, yeah. And so, but that was healthy, and she felt comfortable doing it. So having an environment where someone you're interested in feels comfortable is also part of it.
That's not a great icebreaker, but okay.
I've never forgotten it.
Andrew, did we answer your question?
I think so, thank you.
Okay.
Brian. So, a question that I had was, if two people have different ideas, how would they maybe come together to solve those ideas, even if people had two different views?
So, a lot of a relationship is built around conflict resolution. People talk about having arguments in a relationship. And a good relationship has lots of arguments. They just don't get big. And so there's a lot of tricks to keeping those arguments small, short, and frequent. Because the more frequent they are, the less you're sweeping under the rug or hiding in the fog. And those analogies are good for two reasons, because when you sweep something under a rug long enough, you eventually trip over it, and it's catastrophic. And when you hide something in the fog, eventually the sun comes out, and then you have to deal with it. So you're never going to get away from an argument. You're only ever going to put it off. And there's some strategies to when you should put it off and when you shouldn't, right? Maybe the best time for having an argument isn't when you're both hungry and tired and it's late, right? Maybe you can put a pin in that one and say, look, today's the 17th. We're not going to have a chance to talk tomorrow. If it's not critical, let's talk about it on the 19th, right? Let's schedule a conversation, because this is important. I want to hear you on this. I understand this bothers you, and we got to solve this because I care about you, and we got to make this work. So that's one way of making sure that the sun doesn't go down on your anger, right? The other thing is just listening to the person who is on the other side of the table from you or sitting next to you, right? And when they say, hey, we really got to do it this way, and you're just really opposed to whatever that position is, you got to listen to them. And when they say, hey, I think we should do this because of these reasons, it's really important to repeat that back to them and say, and I think I've said this before, but say, so you're saying we should do this thing for these reasons. And they're like, no, you didn't hear me. And keep going back and forth like that until they're like, yes, that's what I'm saying. And when you have that agreement, it does two things. One, it slows down the argument to where it doesn't get volatile, right? You've taken a lot of your emotion out of it and you're just practicing on listening. And the second thing is, you're not bypassing what they actually said. They feel heard, they feel listened to you, and you understand where they're coming from. And that's really important because maybe you agree with most of what they said. And if you had just blown past that, it would have felt like to both you and to them like you didn't agree with anything that they said. And that's probably not true. And a devastating thing that happens in arguments is that you will find fault with the person for who they are rather than the thing that you're at odds with, right? And you think that they can't change, but you forget that they're a multifaceted, multidimensional individual with tons of character and history and personality, and that they're probably reacting to something, whether it's this particular thing, a trauma in their life, something that happened yesterday, or something even more subtle, and you have no idea what's going on. And so it's probably not about the argument or whatever you're having, whatever your current disagreement is. It might be something else. And it's unfair for you to blame whatever your current conflict is, a fault of your own, on them at that moment. So it's important to sit down and say, look, I'm sensing some negativity in this conversation. I feel like we're not seeing eye to eye. Do you feel that too? Okay, you feel that too. Like, do you know where it's coming from? No, I don't know where that's coming from. Is it from me? Did I approach this conversation wrong? Could I have started this better? No, you were fine. Is it about a decision like this you've made in the past? Yes. All right, now you're closer. Like, you've eliminated half of the problems and you know they're not angry at you, right? Like, that's huge. Like, I can go into a conversation with confidence knowing that they're not unhappy with me. Like, that's huge. Like, my conscience is clear now. I can investigate whatever this is with the person. And it's so helpful. So helpful. So listen, talk. The more you talk, the better. Be really precise about what you talk about. Be precise about what you hear.
So as you're talking about that, conflict resolution is one thing in a marriage relationship. It's a little bit different when we're in a courting, dating kind of relationship. I deal with a lot of conflict resolution in my business because I'm dealing with people, I have their homes torn up, it's torn up for months on end, and you're dealing with money. Okay, so these are like all the marks for disaster that can happen, and I deal with it all the time. But yeah, you have their kitchen torn up after all, right? It's like these people are not eating correctly for months, and so their blood sugar's way off the charts, and I'm dealing with them, And so, but that's totally different than dealing with something when it's at home. And so, love and respect was mentioned, and I learned a lot from that because I noticed that there's some things that I can just keep heaping it on. It's like you're gonna keep heaping it on. At work, I just let them vent, right? But there's certain things though in a relationship with a husband and wife, and you hit that respect issue with the guy, and I just go, and it's like that drop of disrespect was like 10,000 tons of stuff dumped on you all at once as a guy. And so understanding like, oh, why did I flare up inside at that thing? So we could have a wonderful conversation. We probably should have another panel talking about marriage and conflict resolution. But back to your question in the dating relationship, there's times that we didn't see eye to eye on things. She wanted a girl and a boy, and I'm like, we don't have boys in my family. It's like, well, we're just going to have two, and so then, well, what about having a tribe? And well, that means you're not working, right? So that means there's less income. I have to do and we discuss and you work through these issues. And so what is that going to look like? And do you have trust in God that He's going to be able to take care of those things and provide for you? And so some of that is just talking through those things and what does it look like? And how is God going to interact and work in our relationship? And then we make a decision together that glorifies Him. How does it best glorify God? So
I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking about when we were courting, dating, whatever we called it back then, carefully walking. One of the things that I had thought I wanted 2 children. And somewhere along the line, God got a hold of my heart and changed that. And so I thought, that's something I want to talk about. And it was almost one of those things, I guess, I'm approaching this conversation, I'm being prayerful, I'm preparing my words, I'm preparing my thoughts, and I'm thinking, what if he has a very different idea? What if he's like, no? And a friend of mine had asked, well, would you continue in the relationship? I'm like, I don't know. It's kind of, and I remember having that conversation, David, to say we're going to have as many kids as the Lord gives us, that's a big commitment. And, but that's what I felt called to. And at that moment, then, not prior. And so I was like, what's he going to say? How is he going to answer this? And so as we had this conversation, and I don't remember if it was over multiple phone calls or what it was, but I remember him saying, I want to take it prayerfully. I want to take it one child at a time. And I was like, I'm not okay with that answer. I don't know that I said that, but that's how I'm feeling inside. I don't know that I'm okay with that answer. And I remember him saying this, and it was a game changer. He said, if you felt called by the Lord to do something, I would never stand in the way. I was like, I'll marry you. Because if he fears the Lord and he's going to be moved by the Lord in a decision, I mean, that's borne out over time, but that was a game changer for me, that he feared the Lord and would listen.
Well, and just because maybe at that time, in my immaturity, not seeing that, what is the calling that a woman has for her? I'm thinking about, like, what's my calling? How do I be, the man that God wants me to be? But what has God called her to be? And as a mother and a wife, and if we're like, no, I'm just really sure that God's only calling you to 2 kids, And so I need to allow her to be able to fulfill what God's called her to be scripturally for the way that she feels God directing her. So hopefully that answers your question. I had a question as we close up, and I'm not going to say you can't have other questions, but one question that I had for you guys that have courted is you've had parents that are involved, and this is one of the things that is often a criticism of people that court, is that especially dads get so involved into the relationship, and sometimes a young man almost feels like, I'm courting the dad in order to get the right to be able to court the daughter, and I have to jump through a bunch of hoops to be able to get there. Have you had any of that experience? And if so, how did you deal with it, or how do you talk about getting around that, or how should you, as a parent with your own children someday, be able to direct your own children?
I did want to say that, at least for me in our relationship, I didn't feel like my dad set up a whole lot of hoops for him to jump through, or boundaries for him to go through. I do remember in other friends that I knew that had relationships, or who still don't have relationships because of this, but they had a whole list of things that the guy had to do. And not just one person, but multiple people, right? There's a whole list, and the guy has to get all the way down through the list in order to court. And if he skips a step, he has to go back to the beginning, and he has to start again. And I remember hearing about that and thinking that is
27 steps of court.
yes, there's 27. That's a specific example. But I remember thinking that I couldn't do that as a woman. I don't qualify to go through all of these steps in a row. I'm not good enough. I'm not perfect enough in my walk to do that. So it would be unreasonable of me to expect that of a future spouse. And as a parent, I want to approach it in a way that it's something that's reasonable, that I could reasonably have done as an imperfect and sinful kid that I was when we started courting. That I still kind of am. So that's my perspective on that one.
Yeah, and thankfully John was very flexible, and it might have also had to do with my age, right? Because I was 27 already. I wasn't just like a 17, 18-year-old kid, right? So I would say. Well, you're not 17 or 18 anymore. But yeah, I can't really say that I went through a bad experience, because John was awesome.
This is an interesting question, and actually it involves a lot of tangents that I will not go into. But for me, I have to say my father-in-law was a very gracious man. And I was surprised at how little he actually did put me through the ringer to court, be engaged to, and marry his daughter. He really trusted me. And I think that, you know, just I mentioned it earlier, in relationship to, do you have a friend? Do you have a friendship that starts the relationship? If you do, that goes a long way with the father-in-law, because they've already established a track record with you. They've already established an ability to understand you in a lot of different contexts. And so for me, I am very grateful for my wife's father. He was one of the intimidating factors for me to even approach Rachel. But I think he kind of did that as a way to present himself as intimidating. But when I got to know him and we got to talk about some of these things, he was very approachable. And so I was blessed with that. I actually don't intend on being that easy on my future son-in-law. So that is and that is because I do think that there's a vetting process that the father is responsible for. And I feel a certain measure of responsibility. Will I be terrifying? Hopefully, yes. But will I also be gracious and understanding? Yes, as well. I have benefited from that, and I will fully extend that.
Just pray for us, please.
So, young men, here's a terrifying thought for you. Whatever young lady you're hoping to marry, she's just likely coming out of her father's house. He makes more than you do. He's probably taller and better dressed than you. He has nicer things than you. He drives a better car than you. She lives in his house, and it's a nicer house than whatever you can afford. So whatever man you're looking at, chances are he's intimidating as it comes. It doesn't matter what sort of rules he has you go through, it's probably going to be intimidating, even if it's nothing, right? Just him being there and being a presence in his daughter's life, if he's just a half-decent individual to start with, is going to be intimidating. So now, to the fathers, having gone through that, thanks, John, since that's an intimidating process, you're going to want to set it up in such a way that, there's an actual legitimate way for somebody to graduate that, right? You don't want to set up a scenario in which your daughter has literally no one to marry, right? If you do that, it's because you don't love your daughter, actually. It's because you love your own ideals. And so you need to think about whether it's your ideals that you love or your daughter that you love. And probably the hardest thing, and I haven't done this yet, but probably the hardest thing for a father to do is to let go of his daughter. And to let them make their own decisions. Because the more I look at it, I think parents really only have about 4 years to get the heart of their kid. After 4, you have just a couple years, maybe 8, to impart some wisdom. And then they're going to start making their own decisions. Because at 12, they're making their own decisions whether they tell you about them or not. And after that point, you only get to be a guide in their life. You can pretend to be in charge, but inside their own mind, inside their own heart, they're in charge of their decisions, whether they act out or not. And as they get older, whether you have a relationship with your child or not, is kind of up to you on how you acted so much earlier. And if you want them to follow the rules that you have set up for courting, if you want their future husband to jump through certain hoops, if you want them to abide by whatever, you have to get their heart so much earlier. And
what age would you start that topic? You mean,
courtship?
No, the topic of courtship. Sorry to interrupt, but you kind of touched on it. What
Yeah,
age would you start talking to your children about
when they're ready.
when they ask the
Yeah, sure, when they ask their, I mean, it's one of those things that when you do your Bible reading at home in the evening and you're talking to them and you bring up marriage relationships inside the Bible and they're asking about Jacob and Rachel and Leah and all of the different things that, like, these kinds of topics should start priming the pump for your own teaching in the home, right? Where you're coming out and saying, well, you know, so-and-so didn't do it right in the Bible. They did it this way instead. This is an ideal way, you know. Tell family stories. Tell them about your relationship. Tell them the way you wish it had gone, right? That's a hard thing to do in front of your husband. It should be one of those things that they just learn as they grow up. But you can start being really intentional about it from like 8 to 15.
A note on that. Growing up, my parents would address various relational things as we watched movies, as we read books as a family, because relationship comes up in a lot of movies. Everything from, you know, Disney's Toy Story on up. You've got all kinds of relationships that go in there, and they would just point out things that they didn't think were God-honoring as we went along. Like, oh, those two, you know, they shouldn't be kissing. They're not married, or they, you know, this or that. And, you know, you have to figure out for yourself if you decide that that's biblical to kiss pre-marriage or not. But, like, not biblical, but right before you and God. But that was how they started instilling in us ideas of what's a healthy relationship versus what's a lust-filled relationship. And then they'd also share stories from when they were dating, because they both dated. And back to Ryan's Brian's question. That's part of what led me to decide courtship was, or hybrid courtship was, the version of relationship I wanted to take, because I could see what they had gone through, the things they had told me, some things that were good, some things that were like, I'm telling you this, and they always said this, I'm telling you this because I want you to learn from what I've done. I'm not, you know, trying to scare you into doing something else. This is just, and you have to decide for yourself. But doing this led in these directions for us. And so that was very helpful growing up just from a very young age. This is God honoring, this is not. And so on.
Just to answer your question just a little bit more precisely about when you should start talking about courtship and dating. It starts in the really basic principles of how you treat the other gender. And so when I said start at 8, that sounds really young to start talking about a formal relationship, but that's not really what I mean. I mean, when a child's 8 and or younger, you need to start teaching them how to treat the other gender, right? They're becoming adults slowly. And so every day you're giving them more responsibility. And some of that responsibility is delegating to them how they act in public, right? You're not always grabbing them by the arm and pulling them back, right? You're allowing them to go play in public spaces. So they need to treat the other gender with respect and dignity that's commensurate with their gender and with the societal norms that you're in. And so it's important then to start setting boundaries for how they interact with their friends and with the other gender. And so that's where that starts, and it just works right up. You know, the Bible doesn't, as far as I'm aware, describe any other relationship between men and women outside of mothers and sons, brothers and sisters, and married folk, right? So there's this whole idea of like dating, right, where we try and find some amalgamous or hybrid version of that relationship. It doesn't really exist in Scripture. You were either married or you weren't married. And so treating the people across the gender aisle with brotherly and sisterly affection is something that gets learned really early. And your children are going to have problems with that and not know how to interact with the other gender, either by overstepping or being too shy and never interacting at all, if they don't get a chance to play and be friends with people of the other gender early on. So if you teach that, it'll be easy way later.
There are perverted, expressions of every good thing. And so, yeah, yes, there's plenty of courtship examples in Joshua's and my, especially in our upbringing, that turned very sour and had very rotten and bad fruit from it. And essentially, I think the common thread that we saw is that trust was put in man and not in God, and generally the father of either, where the father, basically had this string up here, and they were just controlling little marionettes, and it was demeaning, and it was demoralizing, and it was awful to watch, very, very painful to watch. And it would result in terrible heartbreak, and it would result in kids leaving the faith and people jumping ship, and just terrible trauma there. And again, it's when we put our trust in man, even if it's the father of the one we want to go and spend the rest of our lives with, we're not putting trust in God. And if you can't hear from God, then you have bigger problems than trying to find a spouse. The point is that we're hearing and that we're in community constantly and daily with our Father in heaven. And so if you're not hearing from him, then your biggest problem is not seeking a wedding or a spouse. It's seeking to get right with the one that you are supposed to be in constant communion with. And Joshua and I, Joshua's and our rule list was miles and miles long, and so we don't intend to copy that as we help guide our children through their relationships. But the point is to have an outside source that can see things you can't see, because you do get blinded very fast. In the relationship that I was in before I started courting Joshua, I kept trying to twist things in my head to make them work. Well, that's because of this, and well, he's only this way because of that, or well, you didn't understand the situation right. And I remember my pastor coming to me saying, Rachel, marriage is hard enough without being married to him. And he is a good young man. We were not meant to be together. We weren't pulling the same direction. We weren't a well-matched couple at all. And for him just to be able to say that, along with my parents and every other adult I knew, saying, this is not right, it still hurt. It was hard, very hard for me to see that. But it's God's will that you grow. And he's not interested in you being stagnant, and he'll use any example or any relationship to make you grow. So.
Thank you, that was well said. We're starting to run out of time, but we have two hands that are up out here, and I know there's a couple more comments made, so let's keep them really quick if we can, because we're past time already.
The purity movement has gotten a lot of flack recently because a lot of people have come out of the purity movement with feelings of shame, and especially women being told that to dress modestly, and I hear a lot of people are saying that it puts the onus on women, that we're the only ones who are responsible for our bodies, and a lot of women seem to be getting shame messages from that our bodies are something to be ashamed of. So I'm wondering how you as parents give a better message, give the purity message across without getting those shame messages across, and how also your parents did that for you. How did you come out of that without getting those messages?
For me, I never perceived dressing modestly to be something that I did because I was ashamed of my body. I perceived it to be something that I did because I wanted to control how other people looked at my body. I remember really vividly sitting in youth group, and there were all these other girls, and they all had like the short Duke shorts because that was what everybody wore, and there were all these boys behind us. We were kneeling and praying, and all the girls were in the front. All the boys, for whatever reason, I didn't know at the time, I'm naive, or I was, and they were in the back. And I remember feeling people's eyes like looking at me, and then looking at the other girls, and then not looking at me anymore. And I recognized that I was being protected from being stared at by all these boys, because my shirt was long enough that it covered my rear end, and I was wearing a skirt that was long enough that you couldn't see my underwear. And it was a really vivid moment in my life when I became really thankful for modesty. That my parents had always said, you really should make sure that you wear a slip underneath that dress. It's transparent. You gotta make sure you wear, this, or you gotta wear that. And it was at that moment that I remember thinking, this is a tool to protect me from them and their sin that is already gonna be happening. I can't control it. I never felt like I had to stop it. But I did feel like I could do something about it so it didn't impact me personally as badly as it was impacting other people.
I heard Josiah and Anna talking about like the dangers of going into things too young, too quickly, and you know some of the problems that that's posed. But then I also listened to some things that Claudio and Joshua said, just to you know how old you were when things started going on. So I'm kind of thinking along those lines. You know, I'm 24, almost 25 years old, and like Dave said, you know, I'd had ideas of what I wanted to do as a married person since I was 11, 12 years old. And that, unlike you, I've always wanted to be married. And honestly, the idea that I'm getting to this age with no forward progress, stagnation, as Rachel said, is terrifying. So I'm thinking like back to when you guys were in this age, if any of you had that feeling of, I'm not getting anywhere, what if nothing's gonna happen? How did you deal with that? And what kind of advice would you give to somebody who is?
I have a story that relates to your question. I was 22 and a half, and I remember that I hadn't met Claudio yet. I actually met him the next Sunday. And I was in the kitchen at night with my dad, and I was just bawling, like, I'm never gonna get married. I might as well just become a lawyer. I might as well try to figure out a career. and you know, either that or I just gotta give up. And Dad was like, well, if you're gonna give up, do you want me to drive you to a bar? You wanna quit? Do you wanna quit on the whole, you know, do you really think God hasn't called you to courtship? I'm like, no, God's called me to courtship. And I think God has called me to be a mother. So you can't quit then. I'm like, no, I guess I can't quit. I found it very, very frustrating at the time. But I did a lot of praying that night and for the next week. And then I met this really annoying person at church the next Sunday. I had no idea that he was the one. I had no idea that we were actually out of the fog part. But yeah, I would say that my only counsel for that would be to do a lot of praying and seeking God. And feel free to tell your parents how you feel, because they'll be more supportive than you'd expect. He offered to drive me.
I think it's really important, David, too, that you recognize that this is actually part of your journey, that this waiting part is not you being stagnant, it's not you with no forward progress, it's not you with, you know, still being in the mire and the fog. It's actually God saying, I have things for you to learn while I bring your spouse to you, or before I bring your spouse to you. That it's actually not you failing. It's not you hopeless. God forbid hopeless. You know, he's a giver of hope and a giver of life. And it's literally, there's no substitute for growing up at all. The journey grows us up. And, you know, there's no time tonight, but Joshua has a huge story in the whole growing up game. He was 28 when we got married, and what God did in his heart to prepare him to be a husband and a father. There's no way to get around the growing up at all. And we think of growing up as, you know, toddler to 18. I will never stop growing up. There's people that I look at, I'm like, I want to be like her when I grow up. You know, is that growing up is always happening. And there's no way to make it happen faster. And neither would you wish it if you were to look back. And so I wish I could have skipped that. I wish I could have skipped that. There's no way to skip it and learn what you got to learn through it. And I see you, and I think it's a beautiful journey that you're walking. Very beautiful one.
Not related to that, but just as the overall thoughts to end with, I wanted to be sure and say the difference between general worldly dating and something that's very thought through, prayer-filled, and surrounded by people who love you would look similar to, if you can picture like a tent and it's all a facade. all the way around, and there's no foundation, there's nothing solid to it, but the people are having a great time. And this other side where they're busy building, they're working, they're sweating, they're working together, they're learning about one another along the journey, that's courtship. And that's a foundation. I don't want to say the name or whatever, but that thoughtful, prayerful, careful before God relationship will last for years under pressure. I think back at how many things, I don't know the first time that David went with me to the ER with my mom. There's some health issues there that are just very, very complicated. They're never fun in an ER room visiting with a doctor late at night. But I remember clearly thinking, I would not want to be doing this without him. And when you're in the flashy whining and dining arena of relationship, it can be you can fool yourself into thinking this is what it's going to be like the rest of our life. And it's not. And so if you can just kind of like jump into real life, real time, with the needs around you in your community, in your church, with your people, with your family, and try and bring life. We have a lot of grandparents who are taking care of, a lot of parent situations that our kids are working with. God bless you as you do. These are real, get you ready for the real world, and the blessings are to come. Married life can be a lot of fun, but you don't want to have all the fun up front and there's nothing left, because that's an empty tent.
Yeah, I like what Dave said earlier about the design of, God's design. And you just mentioned about a foundation. And something I would ask is, we're running out of time. But would y'all be willing to take questions, via email?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think this is really good. And something I've been thinking about all this is it really hinges on agreement, and a covenant is what God gave us. And I think it would be really good to study, how we come to agreement to where God has called us. And I've just been challenged to do a study on how Christ looked, or how God the Father looked for a bride, and how he's looking for a bride for his son. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you guys all for staying as long as you have. I wanted to comment, then Emily was out, but talking about the purity movement and some of the stuff that's gone on there, it's important to remember, because the purity movement has some really good ideas and things that are there, but sometimes it's put off that if something doesn't go exactly upon their issues, you become, the used chewing gum, you become used goods, kind of an idea. Like if there isn't grace with God, that we all make mistakes. There's things, King David made some serious mistakes, but God forgave him for those things. And there's purity that's there. There's God that comes, and he is the one that washes and cleanses souls, and he makes things right. But we shouldn't rely on God doing that. But speaking about dress and stuff like that, it's yes, it's your issue and it's our issue. It's a girl's issue and it's a guy's issue. Girls should dress nice, appropriately. But guys, and I've talked to Muslim guys that say, a girl can wear a burqa and just see her eyes and they still can lust after her. So it's not that she has to be completely covered for a guy not to do that. So that's a guy issue that's there, because they are physically attracted to a certain aspect of women. And eyes are one of those things that they're attracted to. But it is also, please cover yourself. Don't come to church in a bikini, because that's going to make it even worse, right? So it's not just like, well, whose fault is it, and trying to do this. Just be modest. Make sure yourself is covered. Don't need to make physical body parts stand out. So it makes it easier for the guys to be able to do what they need to do in trying to avert their eyes, or to be able to not lust in any sort of fashion in that sense. So I don't know if that's helpful in answering that, but yeah, I think just as brothers and sisters in Christ, we just need to remember that we all have different areas that we're going to be failing in, and there's going to be places that we have victory in. And guys are really strong in some areas, and we're weak in others. And the same with women. You have so many wonderful strengths, but there's some areas that maybe you're just not as strong as a man in. And that's the way God has intended it. God has intended it that way because that makes you work together to make a common goal. And so marriage, one of the beautiful things about marriage, and one of the really tough things about marriage, is that in that, when you're married, you have these conflicts and the things that arise, and you're not getting all of your own things. You know, a guy thinks when he gets married, that's like, yeah, so I'm gonna still get the car that I want. Well, we bought a minivan. And we're gonna, I'm gonna have the woman that I want, and we're gonna, have all the fun intimacy we want, and, and then all of a sudden you have kids and things that interrupt, and life isn't exactly the way that you had planned and thought it would be. And so all of a sudden your desires are thwarted because, what, they're your desires, not necessarily God's desires that are happening there. And so in that, when your desires, especially like as a man, but I'm sure it's on both sides, are thwarted like that, it makes you grow up. It sanctifies you is the term that we use in the church, right? You become sanctified. And without being married, there's a certain amount of sanctification that I would never have. There's certain leadership abilities that I wouldn't have just because I'm not leading anybody. And now I have children that I lead, and so that helps me be able to lead a crew of construction guys that I deal with because I know how to deal with certain situations. And so God has ordained marriage and these differences to create something better and unique out of each one of us.